ask us questions and so forth. And this presentation, I believe, Maggie, is posted online. We also have responses to the questions that you all asked at our last work session. And so that's online, and we've also emailed that information to you all. Next slide, please. As has been in our previous work sessions, the heavy lifting will actually be from staff, Taylor Floyd, as well as from Tony McDowell. But I will just kind of summarize out of all of the information that's going to be presented to you. Just if you don't remember anything, if you can remember these three things. Making budget and service delivery changes based on a lot of internal work, community input, and council priorities. I mean, we really have focused a tremendous amount of time on the strategy going through this budget work session of what is it that we want to do? What are the things that are important to the community? And looking internally at our operations to see if there are things that we can do differently. We knew that we didn't have a whole lot of revenue, so we thought about, well, since we don't have new revenue, how can we look at how we are doing things and do them actually maybe differently or possibly even do different things. And all of that has been based on, again, input from the community, as well as looking at your council priorities. There's limited funding available to make new investments in council priorities, at least in terms of where we are with our general fund and the balance. And then the budget adoption is just a step in an ongoing process. And what we mean by that is that we are consistently having internal conversations about how we deliver services differently, that we do them better, and that we be more impactful. So I don't want the community to think that just because the budget has been adopted, that we're going to stop having the conversations. And I think important and informed conversations we've been having with the community, that work will continue. I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Taylor now, who is going to begin this discussion, and want to thank staff because there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone into these presentations between the times that we meet. So appreciate all the work that they've done. And Taylor, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. So I'm going to start just kind of, a broad overview of the process, what you all have done, what we've done internally in the community engagement. So next slide. Starting with key budget dates for council. As Deborah mentioned, we started the work last calendar year. There have been several council work sessions. One change from the last few times that you all have seen this, we have added another council work session on May 11th in a couple of weeks. So wanted to make note of that. And then that last part, is kind of the end of the process there from a budget process standpoint anyway, with the manager's proposed budget on May 25th, a public hearing June 8th, and then ultimately adoption of the budget on June 22nd. Next slide. So these next three slides, again, trying to kind of just give an overview of the internal process, our community engagement work, and then also the work that you all have done. And hopefully, again, it is a review, but starting with the internal process, we kicked off last year, still working through two crises that started in 2020, the pandemic and social unrest born out of racial justice. And, we wanted to use those as an opportunity to push our budget process and our decision-making in maybe a little bit of a different way than we do in a normal year. We were also expecting limited new revenue. So we didn't think we'd have a lot to work with, which was all the more reason to kind of push on that $135-ish million in the general fund and look to that instead of kind of looking at new things that we could do. And a few things that we identified from that work with staff. One, just simply that we have too few resources spread over our services. The second, the differences in community access to information and to the organization itself, be that staff, be that you all or other things, leads to inconsistent service delivery for the community. And then last is that despite the fact that we've put a lot of effort into more community engagement and more equitable engagement, just to note that inclusive community input has been a challenge for us to obtain. And how we want to try to respond to those challenges are really with two main things. One is refocusing our engagement at the neighborhood level, and the second is developing clear data-informed framework for decision-making. And really what we want to do is take these strategies and apply them both to the priorities, the new things we try to do, and our existing services. It's about really trying to do everything that we do in a better and more equitable way. And I just want to acknowledge that this is going to take a long time, and it's going to take a lot of our most valuable resource, which is staff time. But hopefully through that work, we'll actually minimize some of the budget impact of these strategies. Next slide. So looking at the external engagement and what we've done, we wanted to continue the conversation that started with reimagining public safety work in 2020. And we tried to do that in this unique time in which we live with two main things. We had an online survey, and we did 6 virtual community engagement sessions, which wrapped up last week. And some of the things that we heard through that survey and those sessions were that people really wanted to better understand how their personal lives were impacted by the city budget. The second, and I think this links back to that internal work, is people want more access to city staff and services. And then also, again, linking to that internal work, support for neighborhoods, more support for neighborhoods. So looking to strategies, response strategies to those challenges. One is we want to use that work, use those strategies we identified internally to help us achieve these goals as well. And then more specifically, we're hoping to add some funding for small scale neighborhood investment to help that support with neighborhoods and to help our community engagement efforts along. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. So finally, just a review of your strategies and priorities. And again, much like the last 2 slides, that has been a process that's developed over time, starting from the Vision 2036 statement that was, I believe, adopted in 2016, to the work that was done in 2019 to identify those priority strategies, those 13 strategies, to the most recent City Council retreat, where you all identified your 4 priorities listed there: reparations, reimagining public safety, employee compensation, and utilization of rescue plan funding. And again, I know I probably sound a little bit repetitive here, but how we want to try to get these things done, try to accomplish these things, is to utilize those strategies that we identified to help guide our future investments in priorities. And we're going to discuss some of those ongoing and some potential new investments later on in this presentation. And I also want to make note, you'll see sort of a combination of these 3 slides a couple different times. We want to just make sure that we're highlighting the connections between that internal work, the community engagement, and the priorities throughout the presentation. So next slide. Any questions on any of that review before we get into the next section? All right, well, I will turn it over to Tony McDowell.
All right, good afternoon, folks. Mayor, City Council, thanks, Taylor, for that kickoff and update on the process. So the next section of the presentation is going to be a review of some information we provided you all in March, a financial update, and we're going to update you all on some of the numbers that we provided back in March. It's been about 4 to 6 weeks since we gave you an update on the general fund and the enterprise funds and the status of those, of our activities in the current fiscal year. So next slide, please. So just as a reminder that there were a number of things we did this year to balance the budget. A year ago this time, we were looking at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were expecting a prolonged economic downturn, or a downturn that at least lasted for 12 months or so. So we took a number of steps to balance the budget this year. We appropriated fund balance. We did not give any employee raises for the first time in 7 to 8 years. We implemented a hiring freeze, and we held a significant number of positions in the general fund vacant for the first 6 months, and we budgeted those savings in our operating budgets. We also asked departments to keep their operating budgets flat this year, which meant that they had to absorb some inflationary increases that we normally would have built into the budget, but we again held those budgets flat for the current year. And we also added no new services or any service expansions to the current year budget. And we did all those things, but we were able to avoid some of the more significant measures that other cities and other states had to take, for example, furloughs, layoffs, or actual service reductions. And so, again, just as a reminder that those were a number of things that we did to balance this year's budget. And as we go through the numbers, I'll refer back to some of those. Next slide. So just an update on revenue. So when we talked to you all back in March about the general fund and how we were performing this fiscal year, we had 5 months of sales tax data at that point, and our sales taxes were up about 5.8% at that point. And we showed you all a chart. We had assumed going into this fiscal year that we would see some pretty significant sales tax declines, but instead we had actually seen sales tax growth. And that's continued since we last talked to you all. We now have 2 more months of sales tax information that we've received. So we have 7 months of our 12 months for the fiscal year, and sales taxes are now up 8.4% compared to last fiscal year. So we're continuing to see really good growth on the sales tax side. The other 2 points on this slide or carryover from our previous presentation. I want to point out again that we did see better than expected growth in our property tax base this year, and that our other general fund revenues, some of which we had been concerned about because of the economy, particularly in development services and other areas, those revenues generally are on budget for the current fiscal year. Next slide. On the expense side, really no update on the expense side on the general fund. We're continuing to see operating costs at the level we would expect through this point in the fiscal year, so they're on budget so far. We were able to achieve the savings that I mentioned earlier that we built into the budget from the hiring freeze. And so achieving those savings, we've actually achieved a little more than we had planned. That allowed us to utilize some of those savings to provide a frontline and on-site pay recognition for employees back in December. And we utilized some of the savings from the hiring freeze and vacancies, as well as some money that we received from the CARES Act to fund those payments back in December. So next slide. So where does that leave us? So back in March, when we last talked to you all about the general fund, we were looking at revenues exceeding budget, expenses coming in slightly under budget, and we were looking at adding about $2.8 million to our fund balance, which is pretty significant because if you look back at the budget numbers when we started the year, remember a few slides ago I mentioned that we had to appropriate some fund balance in the general fund just to balance the budget this year, and that was about $1.6 million. And so we were anticipating actually having to take money out of fund balance, and that we were potentially going to end up with a fund balance that was slightly under our 15% goal or policy goal level. But instead, we're performing much better. And so our latest estimates as of right now are that we're going to have revenues exceeding expenses by about $3.7 million, which will leave our fund balance at the end of the year at about 17.6%, which again is slightly above our 15% policy target. Next slide. So just to summarize on the general fund, revenues are trending better than expected, particularly sales taxes. The budget strategies that we utilized to balance the budget at the beginning of the fiscal year, in particular the vacancies that we held open, are helping us in the short term, and an unassigned fund balance at the end of this fiscal year will likely exceed our policy target by a slight amount. So moving on to our enterprise funds, a quick update on those. And so we have 6 enterprise funds here at the city. And if you remember back, those are funds that operate similarly to private businesses. And so these first 3 that we have on this slide are our enterprise funds that operate, that are totally funded by fees and require no subsidy from the general fund. And in general, the story across all of these enterprise funds, all 3 of these enterprise funds, is that they're on budget for the current fiscal year. I will remind you all that in the water fund, we did have to make a significant reduction to start the year because of the elimination of the capital improvement fee, which led to a loss of about $7.5 million in the water fund. But we were able to absorb that in the current year by reducing the amount of capital in that fund for the current fiscal year. We are, however, I think as you all know, proposing fee increases to begin recovering some of that lost CIP fee revenue next fiscal year. The proposed fee increases were reviewed last Tuesday by the Finance Committee and received their endorsement, and those will be coming to City Council on May 11th for you all's review and vote at that time. In the Stormwater Fund, again, on budget in the current fiscal year, we did not recommend any changes to the stormwater fee for next year to start the fiscal year. We are recommending that Council and the Finance Committee review the Stormwater Fund midway through the year or after the start of next fiscal year and take a look at the fee and the needs in that fund, because even though we're not recommending a fee increase at this point, there are some pretty substantial operating and capital needs in our Stormwater Fund that we want to take more of a deep dive with you all with and potentially come back and look at a fee increase in the middle of next fiscal year. And really on the Street Cut Fund, nothing to report. It's a self-sustaining fund that we charge utilities for when they use our services to cut the street, and we go out and patch those. So really nothing on the Street Cut Fund to report. Next slide. So the other enterprise funds, the ones on this slide, have been more directly impacted by COVID and the economic downturn. HCCA, the Civic Center, and Transit in particular, we wanted to highlight. Both of those funds do receive a subsidy from the general fund, and revenue in all of these funds is down, and in particular in the Civic Center and parking. And we talked to you all a little bit about this at your previous work session, that revenues are down. We've updated those numbers a little bit, and those revenues in both those funds do continue to be down significantly from where they're at last year and from what we had budgeted for the current year as well. So we are going to be recommending that we prioritize using the American Rescue Fund dollars to cover some of the losses in each of those funds. Those funds did have some fund balance when the economic downturn began that's allowed them to weather the downturn so far. But in particular, in both those funds, those fund balance levels are beginning to dwindle. And so we will likely, as I said, be recommending that we use some of the rescue dollars to cover the losses in both of those enterprise funds. We are, at least in the Civic Center, we are beginning to see positive trends for next fiscal year. There's a significant number of events that are booked for the fall and winter, and so if trends continue positive trends continue on this in terms of the pandemic, we will likely see a return to a somewhat normal schedule at the Civic Center in terms of booked events moving forward. So that's good news for next fiscal year. We're also in the parking fund proposing some fee changes. Those fee changes, just like the water ones, were reviewed by the Finance Committee last week. There was a slight modification requested to the fee changes, which was then approved and sent to Council for its consideration on May 11th. And then finally, in the Transit Fund, as you all know, we highlighted this at our last or one of our previous work sessions with you all. We do continue to offer fare-free service, and we do continue to see additional costs in the Transit Fund due to the utilization of the young buses to provide additional capacity. We do think that we're going to be able to utilize federal funds to cover some of the lost revenue and the additional expenses in that fund. And I think one good bit of good news in the Transit Fund is it does appear at this point that the state funding that was not provided last year, which is about $1.1 million, is likely going to be provided this year. That's the SMAP funding that we refer to there on the slide. So some good news on the Transit Fund. We do have a slight increase, and we mentioned this to you all last time as well, for the contract just to continue providing ongoing service next year in the Transit Fund. So with that, we'll pause and see if you all have any questions on any of that information.
And can I jump in? This is Deborah. It looks like we may be having some technical difficulty. It looks like everyone's camera is off and everyone is muted. So it's going to be hard for us to, let's see, Sage is back in. It's going to be hard for us to.
Deborah, there's something funny going on with our computer.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, because now I can see everybody, but
yeah, now everybody's coming in.
yeah, I don't know if City Hall's got a slower connection or what's going on.
Yeah, everybody's coming in slowly. So thank you all. I just wanted to say that we couldn't see you all if you had, now you're going out, if you were getting ready to speak. So it might be best to just turn on your mic, I'm sorry, if you want to speak, because it's just going to be difficult for us to.
And Deborah, it looks like the stream online is everyone's camera's on, so you can.
Wow.
The public
Okay.
can see
Good.
everybody.
Okay, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay.
Well, you were just asking if anyone had any questions, so just to double check if anyone has any questions. Nope. Go. So.
Okay. Moving on to the next section. So the next few slides we're going to talk about, we're going to kind of shift our focus from the current year and giving you all an update on where we are with current year budgets to looking at next year's budget. In particular, we're going to focus in on the general fund base budget over the next few slides. And then I'll turn it back over to Taylor, and he'll walk us through some of the additional investments and priorities that we're looking at discussing with you all for next fiscal year. So just in terms of the base budget, and you can go to the next slide. Again, as Taylor mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to reiterate as we go through the presentation some of the things that we've heard as a part of our internal and external engagement work that we've been doing over the next few weeks, and kind of tie that into to the story that we're telling you all about the base budget as well as our proposals for next year. And so before I kind of get into the numbers on the base budget, just want to kind of remind you all again of some of the information we provided earlier. In particular on this one, I think I would highlight under the challenges identified, the too few resources spread over services, because I think what you're going to see as we go through the next few slides, and we shared some of this information with you all at the last work session, is that we are seeing some revenue growth in the general fund, but it's not revenue growth that's going to be enough to allow us to absorb anything above and beyond really the initial cost increases that we're seeing next year for things like personnel, for operating costs, inflationary increases and things like that. And so it's really going to be, the base budget is going to be a continuation of a story where it's too few resources spread over the services that we're trying to provide. And that really impacts our ability to provide the services that the citizens are expecting. So we can go to the next slide, please. So to kind of begin to drill down in the numbers, and we did share these numbers with you all at a previous work session, our primary revenues for next year and what our projections are in terms of growth. We're looking at a 5% growth in sales taxes that we're projecting at the moment. Property taxes, we're looking at a 2.6% growth in the base. And we'll spend a little bit of time later on in the presentation talking about our revenue neutral tax rate and what that's looking like and what that means for the budget. We are proposing at this point no fund balance usage in the general fund. And as far as other revenues, we're looking kind of at what their historical levels would be, and their historic growth levels are typically for those types of revenues. So when you put all that together, we're looking at revenue growth in the general fund next year of about $5.6 million. Next slide. On the expense side, and we showed you most of these, I think at the last work session, we do have some expense drivers that are creating impacts in the budget. And again, this is without adding any new services or any new positions or anything like that. But the biggest of which is the unfreezing, if you will, of those positions that we froze for the current year. If you remember a few slides ago, I mentioned that we held vacant a significant number of positions for the first 6 months of this fiscal year. And that yielded about $1.1 million in savings that we built into this current fiscal year budget to balance it. We are recommending that we unfreeze those positions and fully hire and all the positions that we have held vacant in this year's budget beginning with next fiscal year. That will add about $1.1 million back to the budget. We do have some cost increases in other areas as well. The additional state retirement contribution, and we ran through a lot of these, I think, last time. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on those. But again, these represent personnel cost increases simply to continue service levels at the same level that we have been providing historically and in the current fiscal year.
Tony,
yes.
This is Gwen, does this have any increase in salary? I mean, even even, a 5% cost of, or whatever we do for cost of living?
No, it does not. This does not include any kind of salary increases or cost of living increases for employees.
Okay. And then just another question, and I should have asked you at the last pause for questions. Is it okay for me to be asking questions right now? Maybe. Anyway.
Yeah.
So because the math is eluding me right now. To get us back to the 15%, where you're currently projecting we will be for the fund balance, I think you said we were projecting to be at like 17 point something percent. To get us back to 15%, what would and I'm going to use this haltingly, excess fund balance, that difference in the 2% would be?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We can calculate a number. I think, one thing we'll have to take in consideration is when we calculate fund balance for next fiscal year, it'll be off of the new budget. And so since we don't know exactly what the new budget number is going to be yet. Well,
because I know you'd be conservative, unless you don't know how to be a CFO, which I know you do, it would be good to have, a number to think about, to keep us within the 15%, at the 15%, but just to see if there's any play at all with that fund balance for, one times.
Yeah.
I share that. This is Kim. I share that request.
Yeah, well, we can certainly take a look at that and provide that information as follow-up.
Gwen, what are you spending it on?
I was spending it on the fire station and or, a down payment on the reparations.
Oh, okay. Were you doing it on fire station capital or on
capital? Capital. Yeah, only one time. Only use fund balances for one time.
Okay.
Right.
Everybody in my head is swirling because Gwen Whistler is proposing to use fund balance for something. And so I'm just trying to get my feet under me here.
I know, exactly. Hold on to your desk.
Wait, whoa.
I like the way this conversation is going, though. This is Sage.
Yeah, and if we can get you a number, Gwen, before this work session is over, I'll come back to it and give you an estimate of what that amount might be. But if we don't, we'll definitely follow up afterwards. Okay, so moving on. Any more questions before we jump back in? Yeah, so the next slide, again, we wanted to provide some examples, and this is not every single cost increase in the general fund, but we do have some fairly significant ones. And again, this is just to continue providing services at the level that they're providing now, or responding to increases or cost or inflationary increases or things like that. And I just highlight a few of these, and we mentioned these before, but we are looking at a fairly significant increase in our cost for our recycling contract next year. That's about $300,000. That's in the Public Works Department budget. We're also adding some additional money to the budget, to the Public Works Department budget for their storm response. And this is for both winter storms and spring storms. And this is really just kind of in a response to what we've been seeing the last few years, because each year the costs of responding to the storms, in particular the spring storms and the flooding events, tend to be growing. And so we're going to, instead of trying to have them absorb that within their budget or utilize fund balance as we have in some years to cover their needs, we want to provide some additional money up front this year in their budget so that we can begin the year with a little more flexibility there. So all told, everything on this page adds up to about $1.3 million. And again, this isn't every single operating cost increase in the general fund, but it is gives you all a good flavor, and it's some examples of kind of the bigger dollar ones that we're looking at.
Tony, on the recycling contract, I note that, so I can't remember when on the solid waste budget, the sanitation fees that we charge, that is or is not supposed to cover recycling. I can't really remember.
Yeah, so the fee does go toward covering recycling, I think, and I don't have those responses up in front of me. Taylor might, so Taylor, jump in if you have that. But I think in the current budget, the cost of providing both regular sanitation services and recycling was about 5.5 million, and the fees bring in about 5 million. So the fees don't cover 100% of the cost of that. And like I said, Taylor, please correct me if I said that wrong.
Well, could you, again, kind of the same way you gave us history on what the fees for water and MSD was, can you also give us any history on that sanitation fee? Because if I recall, I don't remember that increasing the past couple of years, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. We have that information. And I think you're right. I think we haven't increased it in several years. I can't remember how long it has been that when the last time was that we increased it, but it's definitely been a few years. And that's actually one of the ones I didn't mention that fee earlier when I was talking about the enterprise funds, but that was also one of the fees that was brought forward for consideration by the departments this year. And we went over that with the finance committee last week. And just like with stormwater, that's one of the services that we're suggesting that we do some more work on, develop the business case for the fee increase, and potentially bring something back to you all for consideration in the middle of next fiscal year. Any other questions on this slide?
Just to confirm, Tony, the numbers that you gave were correct.
Thanks, Taylor. Okay, next slide. So on the last slide, I highlighted some things that we're seeing cost increases in. I do want to highlight also some of the things that we've been able to hold flat in next fiscal year's budget, because I think these are important, because these are some of the larger costs in our general fund. And because we've been seeing good trends, particularly in employee healthcare and also in workers' comp and property and liability, we've been able to keep the contributions that the general fund, that the city makes to these programs flat for another fiscal year. So this will be 2 fiscal years in a row that we've held our contribution flat to these programs. And that's good news. I think what it does indicate, though, is it's unlikely we'll be able to continue doing this moving forward, because we are seeing some inflationary pressures in these areas. But again, I think we'll be able to absorb any kind of inflationary increases next year within the existing budget. However, moving forward into fiscal year 23 and beyond, we will likely have to begin adding additional dollars into these programs on an annual basis. Next slide. So just to kind of summarize where we're at in the general fund in terms of base budget, I think a few weeks ago when we talked to you all, we were saying at that point we thought the expenditure increases that I've covered in the past few slides would likely eat up all the additional revenue growth we're looking at. We've gone back, continued to look at the numbers, refined the estimates on both the revenue and expense side. And so right now we're looking at a general fund base budget that has revenues exceeding expenses actually by about $1.2 million. So we have identified a little bit of capacity within our existing base budget to potentially fund some new items next year, potentially fund compensation, because I mentioned earlier from Gwen's previous question about salaries, the base expenses at least do not include any salary adjustments at the moment for employees. Next slide. Okay, so that completes those 2 sections. Happy to answer any questions before I turn it back over to Taylor to go through the next section of the presentation. Thank you all.
All right, so the next section, we're going to review priorities, some ongoing investments that we're making, and some potential new investments. So next slide. And I said that you'd see this slide, a summary slide again. Here it is. And really what I want to point out is, again, what we're trying to do is weave our response strategies into the work we're doing on council priorities. And we're trying to do that by, making sure we're doing engagement on the front end to understand what communities' service needs are, use that to inform decisions that we make, and then circling back with the community on how we're doing and making adjustments as necessary. Next slide. So these are the council priority strategies. Ongoing investments in all of these areas. One example being the staffing support for business inclusion that was in the list that Tony talked to a few slides ago. And want to note, we're continuing to make the investments in these strategies, and we've made some really significant financial investments in certain areas, especially like affordable housing. But in many cases, the investments that we make are a little hard to measure because it's really about utilization of staff time. So we want to talk about some of those existing investments. The next slide is actually a notable exception to staff time being the primary investment in a service, and that's kind of transit. You can see over the last several years, we've made really substantial increases in our investments. And, we know that this is a service that's really important to council and to the community, and, we'll prioritize it for additional investment going forward. One thing I also want to make note of on transit is, we're trying to make sure that we best utilize the federal funding opportunities available to us as we're transitioning towards more normal service operations, which hopefully happens sooner rather than later. Next slide. So another example of some ongoing work is what the Office of Sustainability is doing. And I think this is a really good example of what we hope to do more of. The first two bullets highlights some of the feedback we've gotten from the Climate Justice Initiative from the community on how to improve our engagement. The office is also working to achieve multiple goals around equity, affordability, and sustainability using existing resources to do things like low and moderate income solar installations. They're leveraging partnerships externally with Bountiful Cities and internally with other departments for emergency food preparations and to support resiliency hubs. And again, just really want to provide this as an example of ongoing work and really how we want to go about achieving our goals. The Office of Sustainability is small but mighty, but they're doing really great work pushing forward councils and the community's priorities. Next slide. So we want to highlight specifically two additional investments that would further council goals. Thinking again back to transit, continuing to implement the transit master plan. We've identified about $1 million to move that forward. And then small scale neighborhood grants. This is really about, I mentioned this earlier as well, building on that internal strategy of neighborhood level engagement and incorporating that feedback we've heard from the community engagement in this budget process. And we hope that providing this opportunity will really help us to build relationships at the neighborhood level and, and give an opportunity to make investments in neighborhoods directed by the people that live in those neighborhoods. One thing I do also want to note that this additional investment of 50, we would add to an existing 50 that we've kind of set aside a year or maybe even 2 years ago for this purpose. So the total would be 100,000. So moving into the four priorities that you all identified on reparations, we think that the planning and community engagement process, which is Deborah's spoken about at her manager updates, is going to cost somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000. Here, I just want to note that engagement is especially important in that process, and that transparency and clear goals will be essential to the success of that. Next, employee compensation. Here we essentially want to act on data that we've gathered through the compensation study and implement our new compensation plan to pay staff market value for their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And if we're not able to do that, we're going to continue to lose quality employees to more competitive employers, jeopardizing both our core service delivery and our ability to make headway on your other priorities. So this one is really, really critical for us. The next one, reimagining public safety. Just wanted to remind you all of some of the work that's been done in the current budget year on reimagining public safety. We reallocated some funding to neighborhood community engagement in CAPE, data and performance in IT, and homelessness outreach. And we also reallocated some service delivery for noise ordinance enforcement and animal services to DSD, as well as park wardens to Parks and Recreation. Again, that's not everything, but just wanted to kind of make a note of some of the work that's already happened and continues on. So looking at kind of where we go next, next slide. Oh, yeah, there we go. We got several things. We're continuing to discuss what consolidation of 911 service looks like with the county. We think that could be an additional $1 million cost to the city. We think we need some additional staff resources and development services to meet the service expectations for noise ordinance enforcement and animal services. And we're also working through some partnership opportunities that would change how we respond to mental health and substance abuse crises, as well as the houselessness issue that we're experiencing here in the city. We don't have specific numbers related to those, but we'll certainly keep y'all updated as we refine that information. So I think moving on to the final, or the maybe not final, the last priority, rescue plan funding. Just a few notes before get into the details. What we're trying to do is find that intersection between achieving our existing goals and the authorized use of funds. So essentially, where do our goals in pandemic recovery overlap? And we know that the pandemic has hit our community unevenly and exacerbated some pre-existing inequities in some cases. So we want to move faster to utilize this funding where we can, and where we can lean on that prior work and prior planning that we've already done to help deal with those issues. But we also want to make sure that we're hearing from those in our community that have been hit the hardest, so that we're using this funding to provide for quick recovery and future resilience in the community. And I won't go through these in detail. We showed you all these earlier. I think the first conversation we had on the rescue plan. The Government Finance Officers Association, their guidance on how to prioritize the spending is, essentially around making sure that we're good stewards of public funds, that the city's in a financially secure position, and that we don't spend the money in a way that's going to hurt us in the long run, and that we're maximizing our impact through partnerships. And again, I think that last bullet really kind of summarizes their very, financial mindset, prudent use of funding before we commit the resources. The next one, again, you all have seen this before, the National League of Cities Guidance is around making sure that we're gathering an array of input and assessing options using an equity lens so that we're strategic in our use of funds. They suggest looking both internally and externally, and just like GFOA, they emphasize partnerships to leverage funding, to leverage this funding in the community. So next slide. To the guiding principles that we've established, we adjusted these to more clearly articulate that interest and partnerships that you all suggested. And I also want to say, we want to call back again to those 3 slides that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation to say that we want to incorporate what we've heard from that internal and external work during this year's budget process, and that neighborhood engagement and that clear data-driven decision-making are going to be things that guide our work with the rescue plan, just like they're things that guide our work with our ongoing service delivery. So as we look to some prioritized funding, these are some of those faster track things that we would prioritize based on some of those guiding principles. The first one, is ensuring that we have that long-term financial stability for city services. We want to make sure that we have the resources to manage this project, to engage with partners, to track spending, and to report on progress. We think that over the course of the 3 years, that could be as much as 3 positions at a total cost over that time of around $600,000. And then the last 2 items are really work on addressing houselessness that, again, has been ongoing and certainly is also a significant community priority, going back to that engagement from Reimagining Public Safety and before that. But it's also an opportunity to help us move on some existing plans. So again, these are the things I think from a staff perspective that we would prioritize the rescue plan funding for.
Taylor?
Yes.
Can I ask, the low barrier shelter, you've clearly put a number to that. I assume this is not going to be the city doing that. This is going to be contributing to one or two partners in the city. And can you just give me a little detail behind that 5 million?
Sure, I can, but I might let Kathy do that since she's more involved in that process.
That's what I was going to ask Taylor, if you would have Kathy respond to that.
Thank you. And Councilmember Whistler, I understood your question to be the partners that would be involved in the low barrier shelter and what the 5 million would cover. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we fully are working in cooperation with other agencies and meeting with them regularly, including the county, as well as others. And we anticipate there will be an initial capital cost of the purchase of the property and then upfit to the property as a result of that as well, and then ongoing operations. And we would anticipate approaching the partners and splitting the cost to be able to do all of those things, and then hopefully working toward developing sustainable funding that would carry us beyond December of 2024. Does that answer your question?
And that's in addition to, on the next slide, it's going to show the Helpmate ask and the Homeward Bound ask for their shelters, which are not low barrier shelters, and separate projects.
Okay, so that was my question. Is the 5 million separate and apart from Helpmate? And it is. Okay.
Yes, because the concept behind the Homeward Bound project, which is the Days Inn on Tunnel Road, that would be 85 units for hard to house or folks, but it wouldn't be the low barrier shelter is like an immediate resource. If someone is in immediate need of assistance, you can bring them to the low barrier shelter that night, that afternoon, whatever the case may be. Whereas both Helpmate and Homeward Bound will serve those that are experiencing homelessness, but they are they take applicants, they process folks, and they bring in folks and then house them long term.
Okay, and then the non-congregate sheltering, you're talking like what we're doing at the Red
hotels
and things like that. So this is basically continuing that through December?
No, excuse me. The non-congregate are the two recent hotels that we've opened up. The Red Roof Inn is covered by FEMA funds. So I think, excuse me, this is just an estimate of the cost through June 30th at this point.
For Red Roof and for Ramada, or I thought the Ramada contract, which is on the agenda tonight, is 300 and some thousand. So tell us how you get to this number, Kathy.
Well, we did add some in case we need to go beyond that point in time. So you are correct. There's two hotels that we currently have. We're not actually naming them both, but there's two hotels that we have that we are contracting through that include wraparound services as well. So, I think we did add some additional money to cover in case we are not ready to open a low barrier shelter by that time, but it is for the two new hotels that have been added.
Okay, so to clarify what you said, Kathy, you said through June. This funding would actually take us beyond that date.
It gives us enough room to go a little bit beyond that. That is correct.
I have a question, if that's okay, right now. So when I look at slide 39, the guidance specifically sets forth making racial equity a part of the plan. But then when I go down to the priorities, it's not readily apparent to me how racial equity fits into these prioritized uses. So can someone help me, can someone explain that disconnect, please?
Hey, can you, just to clarify, so can you go back to slide 39? Maybe it would help before looking at that slide. This slide you're talking about, is this the one?
Yes, the guidance says for use of these funds that we should make racial equity a part of the plan. And then 2 slides later, when it says what we're prioritizing, it's not readily clear to me what these uses have to do with prioritizing or making racial equity part of the plan. And rather than assume that it's not part, I was hoping that someone in staff could explain to me how racial equity fits into these prioritized uses.
And can I ask just a clarification of staff? Your total on these 2 slides is 13
million.
15. It's not even, it might be about half of the funds, correct?
Correct.
You're not giving us a proposal for the rest of the funds, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And what we will be doing after we get through this next slide is to talk about how we engage the community to identify other needs and partnerships for the use of these funds. But in terms of looking at equity, I really would even start with just the first one, the financial stability. I think in order for us to deliver the services that we deliver to all people in this community, we need to make ourselves whole so that we can continue to deliver that quality level of services. The non-congregate sheltering and the low barrier shelter, I believe will impact BIPOC community. And I believe that this has been such a huge issue in our community as it relates to addressing homelessness. And I think a number of those individuals will be minorities. That's how we have looked at this in terms of that lens of addressing racial equity.
Deborah, this is Kim. This is one of the reasons why in conversations with our partners, I have asked if we could get some data. I know we can't get all the data for all the people that we're serving, but demographics on some basics of who we're serving in our community with these partnerships.
In terms of under just general service delivery, or are you talking about the sheltering
also,
and the
right,
for
folks
shelter
that are experiencing homelessness?
Okay, we will do our best to get that information. We should have a little bit of it from the complete count. Go ahead.
We do. It's about 30%. 30% are minority that are in the situation of being houseless at this point.
Are there any other questions?
This is Kim. I have a couple questions. One is about transit. I know that we moved to the turnkey model fairly recently, but it is not clear to me what benefits have come from that. I know one of the recent data points that's come out is around on-time performance, but I also acknowledge that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had a significant drop in traffic. So less people are driving. So it isn't a surprise to me that it's easier for us to provide our services on time when there's fewer cars on the roads. So it would help me if we looked at a pre-pandemic data point on what the benefits were because of the significant increase in cost for us to move to the turnkey model. Also, it was named that we've identified $1 million to move forward in transit funding, but not what exactly that was for, or that wasn't clear to me. I know when we've talked about fiscal year 2, for a lot of folks who are following this conversation, fiscal year 2 of the Transit Master Plan named a number of improvements, including operating crosstown routes 2 and 4, beginning construction on a new maintenance facility. But the specific ask is coming from bus riders, Better Buses Together being among them, and many advocates for transit is specifically to increase service to Shiloh, to S3 and S6 routes. So is that what the $1 million is specifically for? Not the entirety of fiscal year 2, but the evening and the S3 and S6?
I do want to clarify that we have not identified funding for that $1 million, but we have identified that the cost of adding service is $1 million. And I anticipated this might be a question. So I believe that would help us cover the cost of extended evening hours and the S3 and S6.
That's correct.
That's helpful. Thank you. So then the remaining question would still be, we're spending significantly more dollars with the turnkey, but are we getting significant benefit from it? And can we identify what that is? Otherwise, as we're looking at future renewed contracts, it may be a cost savings, not only to partner differently with the county, but also not to have this additional expense of this type of contract, because it's not clear to me yet that we should continue in this path.
We'll get responses to those questions, Ms. Rowley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is Kim. I have one other one, and I don't know how to name this yet, except for it was brought up in the retreat by one of my colleagues. When we're talking about reimagining public safety, I know that we're moving dollars around in our organization, but it isn't clear to me yet what investing in long-term safety strategies looks like. Right now, there is some mention of neighborhood plans, and that is like in the spirit of what I imagined investing in long-term safety strategies looks like. Programming with MWBE partners sounds like that, but I think we're going to have to like clearly communicate to community what investment looks like, not just reallocation of dollars, whether that's housing partnerships for deeply affordable, permanently affordable housing, addressing the urban renewal program area losses, authorization of reparations fund, mentorship, reentry, diversion programs. But we might want to just start acknowledging what investment looks like explicitly.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So on to the next slide, which we got a little preview of. But these are some things that we've heard about, and I think to the point that was made earlier, we have not done the work to go through an equity-centric process that would prioritize these requests and help us to understand community needs. In addition to, we still don't have the guidance from the U.S. Department of Treasury to know that these projects, or for that matter, any of the other things on the previous one, are eligible expenses for the rescue plan dollars. One other thing to know that these two requests did come in from these groups, but they did not specifically request rescue plan funding. And also that, we want to make sure that we know all of the ideas that the community has, including those and specifically those that we traditionally haven't partnered with, and that there may be some funding outside of the $26 million in the rescue plan that Asheville will be getting that could be utilized to do some of these things, again, in addition to some of the things on the previous slide. So all of that is to say that we still have a lot of work to do on these requests, on other requests that may come from the community, and on understanding, again, how to prioritize these funds. We still certainly have time to do some of that work, but we do know, again, that we have some pressing issues that we want to try to address more rapidly. So just wanted to make note of that.
Taylor, if I could, we also want to assure you that we are having conversations with the county and potentially with other communities within Buncombe County to make sure that we are coordinating our efforts around these funding opportunities and ensuring that we are leveraging that. Our investments are being placed in the areas where it's kind of I won't say cities, traditional, typical services, but that we are partnering to make sure that these investments are addressing council priorities and that they are responding to what we have heard as issues, concerns, or needs from the community, from those community engagement sessions we've had around the budget. And I think Sage.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if the hand can be seen or not. This is Sage. I just had a question about the priorities language in general, and it might just be that I need to hear it. So when I left the retreat thinking recovery, recovery. Now I see American Rescue, prioritizing the spending. But in my mind, recovery was also like how we look at outdoor dining and on-street parking and all these other things. And could you just tell me those things are still in this plan? We didn't just prioritize just the funding, right? It's the whole recovery picture. Maybe?
Absolutely. This is definitely a discussion around the budget. So it is related to specifically funding, but we are certainly looking at through the lens of our internal work of what do we need to do differently? What are the lessons learned? And how do we make ourselves a heck of a lot more resilient going forward? So yes, we definitely are looking at this from a strategic perspective, from a policy perspective, but also from an investment perspective.
I just need to hear that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If we don't have any more questions, I think it's
I have one more. This is Kim. So we say that we have some challenges hearing from the public and getting that engagement. And we're making a significant stated effort around an equitable engagement process and hearing from community. We've been having these input sessions, but I am concerned that we're going to get that input at that too late an hour to do anything about it. So I do think it would be worthwhile for us to set aside funds so that we can meaningfully respond once what that input is received and compiled.
And if I could, Ms. Ronnie, are you saying that ARPA or the general budget? I know we're dealing with two different kind of pots of monies, but
sure.
If you could clarify, that would be great.
The general fund, like isn't that what we're asking our neighbors to participate in this engagement dueling? Like there were two series of input sessions, one that's ongoing right now and wrapping up. So it seems like if we ask for all that input and then don't acknowledge that we're going to have to then do something about it, to wait a whole nother year might discourage folks from participating in the future.
Yeah, and I just want to assure you that through these processes, we have been listening and trying to incorporate things that we have heard as part of this year's budget process. I just want to make sure that you all know that, because I ask staff every time, are we hearing anything specific? Is there something that, is burning out there? And I don't know that we have had that level of input as of yet, or a specific ask, other than, what we heard is we want you all to possibly invest in some opportunities for us to do small neighborhood projects. And we've responded to that.
I look forward to seeing that line up as far as like connecting the dots would be great. Thank you, Deborah.
So Deborah, what you're saying is your goal is to be able to incorporate the input into a final budget, and we're able to vote for a budget on time that incorporates that input.
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
And I'll also, one of the key takeaway about the process, the adoption of the budget is not going to be the end of the process. We want to make sure that we're continuing that conversation, going back to the community. And, I think from a staff perspective, it's much easier for us to get that engagement early in the process. So we're hoping to kind of do some of that work probably, definitely much earlier and probably in the, summer, fall time period to help inform budget, once we at the start instead of kind of midstream.
And I think what's happening is we have all these kind of separate types of processes that are underway. We've got something around environmental justice, we've got reimagining public safety, we've got reparation, we got all of these which seem to be disparate and independent things. And we're not trying to have those be separate and independent. We are trying to, although, with some of the input processes, maybe they are, but we are trying to, the terminology you used, Ms. Ronnie, connect the dots. So we are in the process now of trying to develop a relationship with our community. We really are. We are trying to build trust, confidence, and a relationship that will carry us way past a budget process, way past a reparations discussion. But I think what we are doing is some foundational things of trying to, again, build trust. We are trying to have an opportunity for the public to better access our services such that, and I know this is important in terms of a monetary investment, but we also want to invest time with neighborhoods. When I first came to Asheville, I asked, where's the neighborhood organization list? Where are the neighborhoods? And people started giving me geographical areas, West Asheville, East Asheville, North and South. It's like, well, what are the neighborhoods? So I really think that I would like for our city to move more toward service delivery at the neighborhood level, the block by block. That's how we're going to make impact. I mean, I've seen it in a lot of other communities, not just Charlotte, but in many more. It's what I did in Chattanooga 30 years ago. So I hope that we can begin this dialogue and the reimagining of getting another staff person to help Brenda. We're actually trying to get out and meet more people where they are and understanding what their needs are and the partnership that we can develop. Because this isn't just about what government can do for them, but what as partners we can do to improve this community. And that's what we're trying to achieve and do. And I know I took you all off the budget discussion and I apologize for that. But.
Oh, I feel like this is in line with the budget discussion, but I have heard more than just a call for neighborhoods. I have heard, and the call still resonates, to divest from what's causing harm so we can invest. And if we just keep pulling from everything but the public safety fund, then we're not really making a shift. So I hope that trust building also includes truth telling.
It absolutely does. And it also, in terms of relationship building, it's actually building trust with Asheville Police Department, Fire Department, Park and Rec Department, all of us.
All right. Now I think I'll turn it over to Tony for the revenue neutral discussion.
All right. Well, thanks, Taylor. And to take us in a very different direction from the previous discussion, I'm going to walk you all through the revenue neutral property tax rate piece of the presentation. So just as a little background, the state of North Carolina in the early 2000s put some general statutes on the books to require all local governments to publish what's called the revenue neutral tax rate anytime there is a revaluation of property within that local government's jurisdiction, either within the county or the city. And so they did that to increase transparency, because prior to that, governments were not required to release that revenue neutral tax rate. And so I think a lot of citizens felt like when they got their tax bills after revaluation had gone through, they didn't really understand how the process works or how the new property tax bills were arrived at. So, like I said, the state put in place some general statutes about 20 years ago to address this, and they require all local governments to publish this rate in their proposed budget document. So you'll be seeing all this information again in the budget document that we published at the end of May. But just to kind of walk you all through this, and I'm not a big fan of reading slides, but I am going to read this because we're following the legal definitions that's laid out by the state. So the revenue neutral tax rate is the rate that's estimated to produce revenue next fiscal year equal to the revenue that would have been produced next fiscal year by the current tax rate if no reappraisal had occurred. So essentially, it's a tax rate that takes away that big bump in property values that folks out in the community have seen. And so there's some specific guidelines about how we calculate that, and I think that's on the next slide. So the budget officer, again, just to read through this, the budget officer shall first determine a rate that would produce revenues equal to those produced in the current fiscal year. You then increase that by a growth factor, and that growth factor is based off of the average increases to the tax base that have occurred since the last general reappraisal. And so you apply that formula, and I think you all have heard me mention a couple times in the presentation that average tax base growth for us over the last few years has been 2.6%. So what we did, and you can go to the next slide, just kind of walk you all through what that calculation looks like. So in the current fiscal year, we have a tax base or an assessed value of about $16.9 billion. We have a current tax rate of 42.89 cents. When you combine those two, we get a tax levy of approximately $72.5 million. I'm sorry. So what we know for next year is that based on the reappraisals and the reassessed property that the county, the data that the county has sent us so far, we're looking at our tax base increasing from about 16.9 billion to 19.4 billion. So what does it look like to produce the revenue neutral tax rate there? So if you go on to the next slide. So again, we take the current levy, we look at the new reassessed value, we grow it by that average tax base number of 2.6%. We do a math calculation, which I won't walk everyone through that. But when you do that, we end up with a revenue neutral tax rate, again, based on the current values that we have from the county of 38.3 cents. And so that would be the tax rate that, again, would produce the same amount of revenue next year as if revaluation had not occurred. So next slide, please. So what that means in terms of additional revenue for the city, if City Council chose to go above the revenue neutral tax rate, is each penny or each cent above the revenue neutral tax rate would generate an additional $1.9 million or approximately $1.9 million in additional property tax revenue. And to give you all kind of an idea of what that means to property owners, so if you're someone who owns a $250,000 property and the rate is increased by 1 cent, then your property taxes go up by $25 annually. And we did the calculation to show what the monthly impact of that would be as well. For $400,000 property, it would be a $40 annual increase, or a little over $3 a month. And so the math on that is actually pretty easy. If you want to figure out what the impact would be for other property values, at $500,000, it would be $50, and so on and so on. Next slide. So I'm going to pause. I know there's only a few slides, but it was a lot of dense information about the property tax rate. So I'll pause there, see if you all have any questions about the revenue neutral rate, and then we'll move on to the last part of the presentation.
Tony, I know we always use 250,000 and 400,000, which is, maybe we should use 60,000. But my question on average, what's the, what is the average value of a house in Asheville? 250,000, frankly, isn't, I don't know that it's terribly relevant. Is 400,000 the average? Or is it something?
This is a Sandra question.
Yeah. So,
well, Sandra, answer me. Yeah.
No.
No, you're not doing it? Oh, okay.
I can tell you the median home price has been 300,000. It just went up 13% to a new median home price of 300.
Yeah.
But that's not average. That's median.
That's median. Yeah.
And also I would point out that's sales price as opposed to assessed value. One thing, in most cases, the assessed value is going to be less than the sales price. It's really seldom that you see it the other way around. And that's because the assessors try to be conservative and they try not to assess a value that's likely to be more than what the property owner could get if they sell the property.
Okay, so the 400,000 isn't out of the ballpark. So that could be a number that people can kind of wrap their head around. Okay.
Yeah, and actually, the county did their presentation around revenue neutral last week, and in their presentation, they cited, for the county at least, the median value was 260.
Yeah, but I think the city's higher than that, probably.
Yeah, ours may be a little higher than that.
Right. Okay. So
it was just in the paper.
Question on the 38.3. That's less than our current rate, isn't it? Isn't our current rate like 42?
42.89.
Yeah.
Correct.
So if someone's valuation did not go up, say your house was appraised at $250,000 last year. I mean, the last time around, it's still $250,000. Theoretically, and we kept their number would go, their property tax would go down, right?
It is possible, yes. If a homeowner's assessed value went up by less or significantly less than what the average homeowner's value went up, then yeah, their tax bill could go down. And I'll also point out that that lower tax rate would also be applied to motor vehicles, and motor vehicles are revalued every year based on depreciation schedules. So everyone will see a decrease in the amount that they pay for their motor vehicle taxes at that lower tax rate.
Can you go to this next slide? Mine's not loading on this other screen, but it's so 38.3 is the revenue neutral number. Okay.
Yeah. So, not seeing the detail. I would be curious whether there are, what percentage of the people out there have actually gotten increases versus decreases? I mean, this is an interesting concept to me that we could be decreasing our tax rate and some people's tax could go down.
Well, that was true last time we did the reval, and it was more dramatic.
Right.
Yeah.
But most people didn't see their values go down, so that was.
That is
one household that did.
Well, okay, but
when I've had a research firm reach out to me about some analysis they're doing on the counties and the city's tax rate and the property values, and I suspect that there's some information in there that you might be getting towards, and maybe I can either have them contact you or send what I received.
That would be great because I love numbers.
Would this explain why a business owner would see their property taxes for their commercial property downtown go down in its tax bill, but their home price in the neighborhood go up?
That's certainly possible, but if the value of their commercial property went up by less or significantly less than the average, then they could see their commercial value go down. But I don't have any specific data on that. But in most cases, you don't see commercial properties going up or going down or growing at a slower rate than you do residential. What you will see is businesses that put the property that they own on the inside, their inventory. Or their things like their business equipment, like for example in New Belgium or at the hospital. Again, those things are valued every year based on a depreciation schedule, and so those pieces of business property will see a lower tax bill next year when we lower if the rate is lowered.
Kim, just for reference, I'm hearing from some downtown building owners, commercial business buildings, that they're seeing as much as a 20% increase. And the last reval was, I think it varied, but it was 30 to 40%.
Okay, any additional questions on revenue neutral? Okay,
we'll move to the blow up revenue neutral. So let's get into it. Okay, so we'll move on to the final
part of the presentation. We do just have a few slides left, and I'll finish this off. You can go to the next slide. So I know we've provided a lot of information to you all this afternoon. So we did want to just kind of end with a summary slide. And on the left, again, kind of highlighting some of those new investments and the cost of some of those new investments that Taylor talked about during his part of the presentation. And you can see if you add all those up, you're looking at a cost of around $10 million for those new investments. And then obviously, if you compare that to available resources on the right-hand side, we mentioned the $1.2 million, the base budget. We gave an example of using some fund balance. We'll go back and look at the question Councilmember Whistler had about the additional availability of fund balance. And so there may be some flexibility there to use some additional fund balance beyond what's in this slide. But just want to kind of well, at least pause on this perhaps. We do have, I think, a couple more slides, but just to have get you all's feedback, any input Deborah may have about this chart and kind of talk through. I mean, are these the things on the left that we've identified? Are those the things that are priorities, and are those the things that we need to be working toward bringing to you all as part of the manager's recommended budget at the end of May? So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or additional comments from staff.
The only thing that I would like to add is that these numbers will likely increase rather than decrease. So, for example, the transit expansion, in order for us to do the service expansions and a number of other things, we think that number is probably higher than the 1 million that you see. I think, Ms. Ronnie, you asked about a number of things in terms of what that 1 million would cover. So I think generally what we are requesting is, and what we hope this chart will reflect is, without additional revenue, definitely it's going to be hard for us to do all of these things. And we want to have you all's input. We don't need you to prioritize what you want to do. We just want you all to just take a look at this. And if there definitely is something that you don't want us to do, we want to know that information. But I'll leave it with that. And if there's a couple of hands raised, Mayor, and I don't know if you want me to call on them or if you'll call them.
Go ahead, Deborah.
Okay, I think Sage raised hers first, and then Ms. Whistler will have you, and then Ms. Ronnie.
This is a transit-related question as well. If we go back one slide, can we go to 54, page 54 real quick? Oh, I have an extra slide. I have a slide in my document that's not up here, and it shows the funding options. It has like a little grid of what, I don't know how else to show it to you.
It's slide 54. If you go back one, what happens?
It's almost like they skipped it.
I think that was something from an earlier draft of the presentation that we had taken out. I thought
it's linked on the agenda, just FYI.
Yeah, and my only question is, because it was helpful for me to see it in this way, and what it does is show like which of these requests can be paid for by a fund balance, or what can be by the tax base, and what can be by the ARPA, and just a little grid. But I see transit expansion under tax rate, but I guess I had thought from another meeting that there was another infusion of money related to transit and rescue planning that wasn't the ARPA, or maybe someone could clarify that for me, because
was it SMAP that Tony was talking about at the beginning of this? Was it SMAP?
I didn't think it was that either, but I could be wrong. I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't something other than just tax rate that was able to tackle some of the transit. I guess Kim may know.
I think that there would be kind of our normal allocation of federal funding from our MPO. And there may be some in the future, possibly for an infrastructure program. I don't know if there may be something separate under ARP that's separate from the ARP, but we definitely have to look at that.
This is Kathy Ball. We are getting an additional amount of funding through the transit funds through FTA for the second round under this amount, there is approximately 4.1 that's going to the whole region. Through the normal formula, our amount would be 1.8. It has to be used to address COVID issues. So we're still working on exactly how that would be. And we may be able to get additional funding, but additional more than 1.8 out of that, but we don't know yet.
Thank you, Kathy. And I think that point, the conversation I was in, I'm blanking on what meeting room it was that because of the way the pandemic has impacted people and their accessibility and losing their cars, that it might be possible some of those South Asheville routes could be considered access and recovery. But that was just a conversation, so putting it out there. I think Kim had her hand up too, and Gwen.
Yeah, I think Gwen, you were next.
Okay, thank you. Since we're calling out things of $100,000, we'll have a reduction in our Black Mountain transit. Please do not forget that we are still spending money already that we should not be spending money, and that's inequitable to our citizens of Asheville. This isn't only a budget thing. So if the county or Black Mountain isn't coming up with those funds, I hope that as of July 1, we discontinue that service outside the city limits. And again, not meaning to drum on this, but I feel, we've ignored, we've not addressed this since at least February and probably before that. I asked a question back when we had the employee compensation, where we talked a lot about the effect of, and I'm very supportive. I'm very, very supportive of the employee compensation increases. I think it's essential, et cetera. However, I did ask whether, given that we hope not to have as much turnover, what, if any, savings are we going to have? I think we have to have some sort of assumption relative to that, even if you can't allocate it to department by department. Hopefully, it's kind of like otherwise the argument for the compensation reducing turnover is a little not logical. And I would like to, again, maybe, not right now, but understand where we get the $1 million of the 911 service consolidation. Is that one time? Is that et cetera? And I can't remember who asked it, but can we just go through and, for some of these things, are they one time? I realize the reparations process, is never going to be completely one time. We're never going to be finished with that, I get, but understanding that to think about the whole fund balance conversation, I'd like to understand.
Ms. Whistler, if I could respond to the reparations, you are exactly correct in terms of it being a one-time for this particular upcoming fiscal year for the process. What we identified is once the commission is formed, that they would get a little bit of a stipend for the time. We're looking at facilitators. We're looking at if there's in-person food, their committees, facilitators. That's what and that's the upper range that's reflected here is the 300,000. We said 200 to 300,000.
Okay. Yeah, I would just, again, to kind of think about if we are looking at all about fund balance utilization,
one-timers,
one-time things, and then, if we can think about that too. And and just so people, it seems to me that the county sort of floated the idea that they would have a tax increase. I don't even know how I feel about that. But, you know, I think we have to consider that. But at the same time, you know, just because they sort of said it first, I don't know that we should feel that we should not feel like, well, because they're going to increase taxes, we can't.
Kim, were you next?
So I think one of the things we have to remember is there is an advocacy for the county to come back into partnership with paratransit funds. We made a choice a couple years ago to move Spruce Hill Apartments to the 170 Black Mountain route. And in the first 3 months of the pandemic, didn't serve Spruce Hill Apartments at all. And these are the people who live in Asheville, didn't have access to groceries, didn't have access to essential employment, being able to get resources for elders and family members. So I think we need more partnership, not less bus service. Whether that's Black Mountain, the county, revisiting former partners like Warren Wilson, just for example. But one of the things that's really like heavy on my mind here is this price tag of $7.8 million for the employee compensation. And so when I go back to slide 34, moving employees to new minimums, 4.5 million, that's where I think we start. And then if we just do across the board percentage increases, we're going to get back in the same pickle that we are now with an even bigger wage gap. Like, is there another thing that we can put on the table that's whether it's like an amount increase across the board, but not a percent increase? Because, for example, 2 or 3% cost of living increase for someone making $40,000 is very different than someone making $200,000. I know that we all know that.
So just to clarify on the employee compensation, that 7.8 is not an across the board percentage increase. Those are salary adjustments that are tailored to each class of employee to correct their salary to bring it in line with a competitive salary. So it might mean, you know, a large percentage for one employee, but it might mean a very small percentage for another employee is my understanding of how that would actually work.
That is
correct. It was
correct.
also presented that we would look at a percentage in the, like, I just think we have to talk really honestly about if we go back to where we came from, we will end up back where we are now at some point soon.
So is the 7.8, just to clarify, Tony, does the 7.8 include some kind of across the board COLA or, you know, like an annual 1% or 2%, or is it just to implement the compensation study?
So it's a combination. So employees who were not part of the compensation, who wouldn't receive an adjustment based on the Archer study, we do have programmed in a cost of living increase for those folks. But kind of like back to what Ms. Campbell was saying, you know, some of the obviously the folks who are impacted by the Archer study are going to receive a much larger increase than those folks who just received the regular cost of living adjustment.
Okay, and
So
I think Sage
I just needed some clarity on that. I didn't realize that we had groups of employees that were not part of the comp and class study.
They are, but they they were studied, but they may be at market, which we are glad. We're happy for them.
Gotcha. Okay, That makes sense. And then I just wanted to share one little sentiment. I'm just a little, I guess what we're doing here is targeting the listening sessions with $300,000 and getting that off the ground. And maybe we're hoping that a hotel will come through and put some money into the fund or something. But I'm a little concerned that we're not actually saying we want to establish.
I didn't understand what you just said. What do you mean when you said we're targeting the listening sessions with $300,000? Do you mean as an example of a cost of a value of a home?
No. I see on here
the
that
reparations
$300,000 to get that process off the ground and have
the reparations.
Reparations.
I thought you were talking about the
reparations.
budget listening session. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. The reparations process, which we have identified the first phase is the listening sessions. And if I heard properly, this $300,000 is to get that going. I'm just a little curious if, I don't know if reparations fund should be a line item on here. I think Gwen spoke to it as a fund balance item, but I just wanted to express that I kind of assumed that we would be doing that this year.
So as part of the deliverable for January 20 22 as a recommendation for short-term initiatives. And that's in the next budget cycle, we would be looking at funding opportunities for reparations, however that looks as a result of this process.
Okay, thank you. I know we have a lot left to do before we're ready to even begin spending money. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
And that we would get there a lot farther if we really heard the call to divest 50% from the APD and invest in long-term safety strategies. And we're talking about, like, even if it was $5 million a year for the next 3 years, it would get us a lot farther towards meeting those goals for community investment and addressing root problems of the harm that's been caused.
I suppose we do have a couple opportunities, right? That we may see a hotel application that contributes to a reparations fund. We also had a community group that sought out a grant. You know, maybe there will be some other alternative things show up in the community.
One thing I wanted to just put on your minds is that the county is looking at, and I believe we've already looked at this at a finance committee level, a program that exists in Charlotte and in Durham that essentially gives a property tax break, and that's not the right terminology, it's sort of like a grant refund, to income qualified homeowners. So it's an income qualified need-based program, but to help offset rising property taxes. Well, really, it's not so much our rising property tax level, it's the value of folks' property and the resulting property tax bill. This is used in Durham and Charlotte. We've examined it before. The state, as you may know, has pretty limited options for us in terms of flexibility on setting property tax rates. We can't do differential rates. We can't do commercial and residential rates. We can't do second homeowner differential rates. We're really limited. But one thing the state's created is the homestead program, allowing for seniors who are income qualified to have a reduction in property taxes. So this is sort of a similar program, but it wouldn't be age restricted. It would be income restricted. So keep that in mind. I think the county is going to be looking at how to implement that. They would have the difficult task of sort of figuring that out and how to identify homeowners and the collections of it, because they handle all that for us. And so, our task wouldn't be as difficult in the sense that we could just opt to join them if they do it. What would be challenging is trying to figure out that fiscal impact, of course, and what the possibilities would be for us. But I just wanted to mention that they're looking at it, and the chairman called me this weekend and we talked about it, and I wanted to share that with you all.
But that's not specifically related to reparations, right?
No, this is just it's an anti-gentrification preservation, if you will, kind of a policy that helps folks that are income qualified with their property tax bill.
I would, and we did look at that a couple years ago, Esther, and I might ask Brad to pull that presentation. I mean, it's like I remember the presentation, but I can't remember when it was. But it may be helpful to share it with all of the council members, because it was like you could only use one of the programs, and we weren't as excited about it as it seemed. It seemed like a great idea, but then when you delved down into what you could actually do, it wasn't the greatest program in the world. Maybe that's changed, but it may be good information for people. I just don't want. I got kind of excited about it, and then my balloon got popped, and I'm just.
And I think it was Tony, Ms. Whistler.
Was it Tony? I thought.
Yeah. Well, Brad helped me gather the data and help me with some of the questions, I think. But it was February of last year, believe it or not. So it's a little over a year ago that we did do a presentation to the Finance and HR Committee Councilmember Whistler, I think you're the only one still on the committee from then. But yeah, we have that presentation. In fact, we looked at it a couple days ago, and happy to share that around with you all. And it does have information about the Durham and the Charlotte programs that the mayor mentioned.
And maybe Esther, you could go ahead and forward that to Brownie and the other commissioners, just, again, so that we're not starting from scratch.
I'll just quickly share that this is reminding me of the Luigi process we have, land use incentive grant, where we rebate back property taxes in exchange for developers producing affordable units. And I wanted to share that previous to my time on council, the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee had suggested this as a possibility for lowering or rebating property taxes for landlords who continue to rent the units at an affordable rate. So just throwing that out there. But I'm curious if anybody knows if there is an outreach component around the senior property tax homestead, or if the county tackles that, or if anything is done. I mean, there's outreach.
It's in your letter. When you get your reval, or when you get your tax bill, there's all the information about resources. And
I'm showing my age. I didn't know that. They don't send me that.
Wow. I just told my mom with her. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, we actually reached out to the county last year when we were putting the presentation together and asked them some of those questions. And yeah, they do the outreach. And at the time last year, they felt like the availability of the program and the folks who were using it, that they were hitting, and most of the folks who were eligible were taking advantage of the program. But it is limited because it is age-based, it's income-based. And so there's not a lot of folks who qualify for it. But the county did feel like it was getting good usage. Okay. Any additional comments or discussion on this slide? We have just a couple more slides, and then we'll finish up. But I definitely don't want to cut off conversation here either. Okay, Beth, I think you can go to the next slide then. So again, just as we end all these presentations, we want to remind you all in the community of the key takeaways. And I think Taylor and Ms. Campbell did a great job of covering these earlier in the presentation, so I won't spend a whole lot of additional time on them. Again, we're just trying to tie together all the work that we've been doing, and we're trying to build on that for next year as well, and acknowledge the fact that we still have a lot of work to do, and that a lot of the work and the planning will continue on, obviously beyond budget adoption in June of this year. So we'll end with just another reminder of the dates that are coming up for City Council. We'll be back for a final budget work session on May 11th with you all, and we'll develop the agenda for that work session kind of based on some of the feedback and questions that we've gotten from you all today. At that meeting on the night of May 11th, we'll be bringing forward those fee adjustments that were taken to Finance Committee last week for consideration by the full council. And then we'll be back 2 weeks after that on May 25th with the presentation of the manager's proposed budget, which will then be followed by the public hearing in June, and then budget adoption scheduled for June 22nd. So I think that's our last slide. Again, thank you all for the time. Happy to answer any additional questions or any additional discussion that you all may want to have. So thank you.
Just wanted to say, Tony, you're sailing right into your new role. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Deborah, is there anything else we need to close out with at this time?
No, ma'am. Other than I'd just like to thank again staff as well as council. I know this is a long day for you all, but I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, everyone, quick break, and we'll be back here at 5 o'clock. So we're adjourned. Thank you.